So let's begin in South Africa, where Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor has stated that the country will need to discuss the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin before taking any action. The warrant was issued last week alleging war crimes in Ukraine. As a signatory to the Rome Statute, South Africa is obligated to detain Putin and bring him to trial. Naledi Pandor has said that consultations with the Russian side will come first, and then the government will need to examine existing legislation and hold discussions within its cabinet and with its colleagues in Russia to determine the way forward.
Now, despite Western criticisms, South Africa has maintained close diplomatic relations with Moscow, including joint naval exercises last month. In 2015, the South African government faced criticism for allowing Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir to leave the country despite an ICC arrest warrant, with the government arguing he had diplomatic immunity. And joining us for this conversation, we have Aliyah Vyas, International Relations Specialist. She joins us from London, United Kingdom. We also have Lwazi Somia, Senior Researcher, Southern Africa Liaison Office. He joins us from South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful.
We're happy to have you.
I would like to begin with you, Aliyah. I mean, we've had Vladimir Putin in the news for the past days. We've seen the war going on in Ukraine. Now, what specific acts of war crimes has Vladimir Putin been accused of committing in Ukraine? And what evidence supports these accusations?
I think specifically, if you look at the ICC's warrant of arrest that was issued not too long ago, there's an emphasis on the deportation of children as a recognized war crime, and secondly, which I think hasn't really been emphasized in the press as much, is that alongside Vladimir Putin, the ICC also issued the arrest of Russia's child commissioner, the head of the Office for Children, and again, emphasis on the role that children have played in this conflict. So largely the deportation of children, but also just general, the fact that Russia has illegally, invaded Ukraine and exposed its people, not only Russian people and Russian individuals, but also Ukrainian individuals to war. So, for example, the extensive use of military weapons and the kind of fallout from that. I think what's really important here is to note that the ICC has for a long time been kind of a symbol of Western multilateralism, but also Western machinery. I think the emphasis on the ICC's warrant of arrest really has to come in when we think about symbolism and we think of how this symbolizes to the rest of the world, and especially to the 123 countries, as you mentioned, that are party to the Rome Statute, that Western machinery is working right now. Its legal system is working to add to the West's kind of retaliation on Russia for its actions towards Ukraine. So it kind of comes as a sort of compounding NATO's existing efforts, whether that's military or economic support to Ukraine and to surrounding countries that have been affected. For example, Poland, the West can help more than just in terms of economics and or finance rather, and military support. That the legal system is at play as well.
Thank you, Aliyah. I'd like to bring Lwazi into the conversation. Now, Lwazi, can you explain the criteria and legal process followed by the ICC in issuing arrest warrants, particularly in the cases where the individual is a head of state, like we saw with Omar al-Bashir in 2015. Russia is also not a signatory to the Rome Statute of the ICC, and experts have said there is the high possibility the arrest warrant will never be executed. Now, what does this make for what impact will this have, and what's the point if the warrant is never executed?
Thank you so much for the question. And part and parcel of this, the crisis that we face is that what Minister Naledi Pandor has highlighted are the contradictions that exist within the current international criminal and investigation system, in particular relating to international law and its applicability towards the broader international system in terms of head of states and those it chooses to put in issues out warrants of arrest. If one reads the warrant of arrest itself, it says it suspects that President Vladimir Putin has conducted certain war crimes within the Ukraine region. And secondly, and since this year is the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, along with the human rights atrocities generated within Iraq, this brings out a lot of contradictions in which the global South itself has criticized the ICC of being. And this is why South Africa in 2017, the African National Congress within its party resolutions wanted to withdraw from the ICC, primarily placing the contradictions that currently exist within the ICC spectrum and the Roman Statute and its applicability towards the broader international system. And on top of that, how that withdrawal was then withdrawn by the South African government on the basis that the Malabo Protocol itself was not ratified by broader African states to establish an African court and other multilateral institutions towards bringing justice to those who are historically disadvantaged or those who war crimes have been committed against. So this entire notion of President Vladimir Putin being arrested brings into consideration the historic criticisms towards the ICC of it being a puppet of the West, and these are the criticisms that are primarily emerging within the narrative concerning the arrest warrant issued out on President Vladimir Putin, and part and parcel of that, South Africa wants to inculcate itself on its non-alignment position, and the arrest of President Vladimir Putin will further undermine South Africa's non-alignment position, and going forward, South Africa will have to consider deeply its future relations, not only with the ICC, but also with the international community in terms of the various legal precedences that have been set that are contradictory towards what has happened historically when it comes to war crimes and crimes against humanity.
All right, thank you so much, Lwazi. And I'm going to bring in Leah into all of this. And while there's so much criticism, just like Lwazi said, on the ICC being either not fair or not transparent or biased in its trials, I mean, even the Russian president and Naledi Pandor also mentioned different other cases that have not been tried by the ICC. But we know that Russia is not a signatory to the time statutes of the ICC, but South Africa is. Now, the foreign minister said there'll be consultation with the cabinet. But for now, while there's still talks of whether South Africa will excuse itself from the ICC, it's still a part of the ICC. So where does it place South Africa? What impact will it have? And will it actually be forced to execute, or rather to, follow the ICC's arrest warrant if Vladimir Putin actually comes into South Africa?
I think, on paper, the answer is very straightforward. As a party to the Rome Statute and a member, party to the ICC more broadly, you do have certain legal obligations to fulfill. One of which is if the ICC does issue a warrant of arrest to a country, or rather not to a country, but to an individual, and if that individual steps on the soil of a party to the ICC, you do have a legal obligation to make an arrest or make some sort of legal notification to the ICC that you are taking some sort of action. In 2015, as referenced, the South Africa, traded very lightly, and I think this time around, I think South Africa, we've got to rather recognize the broader context of BRICS and South Africa's existing relationship with Russia, both on a political level, diplomatic level, as well as existing economic ties. The presenters have earlier mentioned that the upcoming BRICS summit poses that that very challenge to South Africa, whether to act on its legal obligations to the ICC and make an arrest on Vladimir Putin or not. And I think truly that question is a little bit too reductive, simply because. And as I think Naledi Pandor was very skillful in her comment to the media about how the fact that the cabinet and the country broadly needs to consider its options, when it comes to what to do with Russia, because for example, it's South Africa's turn, its presidency in BRICS, and this year, and it's the theme of the BRICS summit really is an emphasis on multilateralism, on mutual cooperation, on economic prosperity. And when we consider this, we have to say that South Africa has a lot that it's currently gaining from Russia, whether it's historically from its existing ties to Soviet Russia, to in the present day where diplomatically it benefits from those ties, economically it benefits from, my apologies for the noise, economically it benefits from relations with Russia. So I think right now, and Luazi kind of hinted at it, it's South Africa is straddling a very fine balance as to what to do, whether to appease the rest of the West, that is very much full speed ahead supporting Ukraine on a diplomatic level, economic level, military and defense level, or to kind of understand that it's got these existing ties with Russia, and it is a leading member of BRICS, and what to do there. I think I've said, on numerous occasions since the beginning of the, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think South Africa needs to take a very proactive role in the Russia's invasion of Ukraine by acting as sort of a peacemaker, highlighting its existing, diplomatic profile as a peacemaker and one who champions human rights on the international stage, and by doing so is. It can do so by sort of emphasizing kind of by providing a sort of platform for peace talks, or at least bringing all parties involved in Russia's invasion to Ukraine to the table.
Thank you, Aliyah. Luazi, EFF leader Julius Malema on Thursday said no one was going to arrest Mr. Putin while he was in South Africa. He even offered to drive him from the airport to the venue of the event and drive him back. He says Russia played a huge role to support the struggle for freedom. And Mr. Malema said that the South African government should not give in to pressure from the ICC, which he accused of hypocrisy. And in your opening statement, you do speak to the fact that this year marks the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War. As we speak, over 30 individuals are still held in Guantanamo Bay without trial for years. And we saw what happened in Iraq, Libya, and other places. So they always point to these allegations that the ICC is unfairly targeting Africans and it's politicized. What's the position of the African National Congress and other opposition parties in South Africa if they release a statement with regards to all of this?
So South Africa finds itself in a very unique and very weird position in terms of international relations and international affairs, and in particular relating towards the invasion of Ukraine. South Africa has positioned itself as a non-aligned state, which means that non-alignment itself is not necessarily neutrality in the conflict. Neutrality is a legal position in the international affairs where it means that one does not provide any form of diplomatic relations to other warring parties, whilst non-alignment itself means that one can initiate diplomatic relations with other warring party at hand, and therefore engage in a more process of more peaceful dialogue. When you look at South Africa's international relations standing concerning the Russia-Ukraine war, and in particular looking at the voter explainers of the UN General Assembly, you will also realize that South Africa itself has positioned itself as a mediator towards dialogue. And this comes from South Africa's its history out concerning dialogue in order to resolve conflict and how South Africa has historically approached conflict within the international arena. You look at instances such as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission within South Africa, which provided means towards dialogue in order to resolve longer-term peace and security issues within South Africa. And we have replicated that within the international community. More recent example is South Africa playing safe houses within the Ethiopian and Tigray region and Eritrea conflict within Africa, where South Africa plays safe houses to allow dialogue between the warring parties. And it is the same methodology that South Africa has approached concerning the Russia and Ukraine war, because South Africa sees itself as a mediator towards conflict and believes that conflict can only be resolved through dialogue and processes of negotiation and settlement of the differences at hand. Now, within South Africa itself, some opposition parties, such as the Democratic Alliance itself, have taken clear sides in support of Ukraine, whilst the broader ANC and also the economic freedom fighters have taken a position of supporting a situation of dialogue between the warring parties, and that will be mediated by international actors, in particular the UN Secretary General, playing a very key and pivotal role in the matter. And an additional aspect of this is how now Western actors, even with a resolution presented forward by China's 12-point plan, have completely rejected the plan, resolving for a longer-term warring effort towards the situation and resolution of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, rather than going forward towards a diplomatic resolution towards the conflict. So these multi-layered initiatives that have taken forth within the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the impact that the conflict has had on Africa in terms of our imports, in terms of grain, our imports in terms of oil from Russia, and also our bilateral relations and multilateral relations in institutions such as BRICS, and also in the UN General Assembly and other relevant multilateral institutions, has highly impacted the African continent. And South Africa, due to its relations and historic relations with Russia, is now paying the brunt, as we have seen other Western countries trying to block South Africa in multilateral institutions such as the Human Rights Council, and which South Africa has played a key role in also facilitating some form of negotiated settlements and warring aspects within the African continent, and also broader within Europe and the Asia Pacific region. So in all these conflicts that are currently happening, what we also see is that South Africa is seeing that the Russia-Ukraine war as a broader continuum of instability within the international system, and that instability itself needed to be handled through peaceful dialogue, negotiation, and diplomacy, rather through facilitation of arming of the Ukrainian forces or Russian forces, and taking a non-aligned stance that will create an environment of dialogue. When you look at African voting patterns within the UN General Assembly, you see African states being split between two aspects: one of non-alignment, and the other one on still non-alignment but voting against human rights atrocities.
Lwazi, I want to bring in Aliyah on this, because you're raising a very valid point now, and still on the broader scale of things. We've seen how things have actually played out at the UN security meeting, which you actually talked about, where somehow among the Africans the vote has still been divided. Some have abstained, while some have clearly voted in favor of Russia. We've seen that in Eritrea and Mali, while others have actually voted against Russia. Now, for you, Aliyah, it seems like the Western powers are all trying to isolate or show how isolated Russia is. And Russia, on the other hand, is still trying to look for African or more allies. We see a meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and even Russia. So on the broader scale of things, how isolated is Russia actually, its allies and those who are against it?
I think it's a really topical question at the moment, given that if you look at Western media, Russia is exceptionally isolated, and NATO specifically has made sure of that on an economic level, on a diplomatic level. on a defense scale. They are doing everything they can to not only bolster Ukrainians, on the front line, but also surrounding states. Every NATO state has, we've seen from the UK, from the EU, various defense ministers meeting almost on a weekly basis to determine how much more they can give to Ukraine and surrounding countries that are affected. But then you look at, as Luwazi mentioned, UN voting patterns. When it comes to Africa, what is the view on Russia almost? And I think when you consider that the BRICS bloc has gotten so much attention in the past year and a half, or rather in the past 6 months more prominently, because countries not only in Africa such as Angola, but also you can see countries in the Gulf like Iran, like Saudi Arabia, are interested. They're placing their bids, their applications to join BRICS. So I think when we think of BRICS as something that Russia has a firm hand in, has a firm influence in, and how countries are not expressing fear or hesitation to join something that Russia is so deeply affiliated to, you can kind of see that, I think countries are very skillfully, if I can say, considering their priorities, as they should on a diplomatic level, considering where they, with the changing kind of dynamics on the kind of landscape of multilateralism or international relations rather, that we have today, countries are skillfully, prioritizing their needs first, as opposed to kind of understanding, we should just follow the West blindly. We should follow the kind of preferences of larger, more powerful states like the US blindly. And I think we're really starting to see that that's not the case. As I mentioned, applications to join the BRICS bloc are flooding, are coming in at a fast pace rather, and I think it's kind of almost also evident in UN voting patterns, where countries are not only considering their own priorities, whether economic, political, or historical, for example, but also considering that the changing dynamics of the current international relations landscape, to say that the West or the US is not the hegemon anymore. And I think that was evident in the meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping, where they said very blatantly to the media that we're doing something here that hasn't been done in over 100 years. And I think that in my interpretation, that very much says we're changing the dynamics of this landscape. We're not allowing the West to dictate anymore. And no, that's not necessarily a for or against kind of position when it comes to Ukraine, at least on my part, but it's rather to say that we're not going to be bullied into making any kind of rash decisions when it comes to peace, or when it comes to even scaling back in any way. So go for it.
Thank you, Aliyah. Luwazi, if you can, in less than a minute, because it's a very important question that we have to discuss on this subject. Aliyah did talk about the BRICS and how the world is looking at a more multilateral, multipolar world order. Now, South Africa is having South Africa's turn to have the chairmanship of the BRICS this year. Can you explain the role and significance of BRICS in global politics and trade, and how the current situation may impact the group's cooperation and relationships? If you can, in less than a minute, I would appreciate it. I know it's a tough task, but yeah.
I'll try wrapping up with less than a minute. But what BRICS represents is a move away from the 1945 Bretton Woods institutions, international arrangement that has facilitated Western dominance within the international markets. And part and parcel of that is that BRICS is trying to create a new multipolar world. And this is why you see major countries within the African continent, such as Nigeria and Egypt, applying towards BRICS, and in Egypt being recently accepted in the new BRICS Developmental Bank. And part and parcel of that is other countries, such as rich countries such as Saudi Arabia and China, facilitating peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which the West has failed in doing in over 20 years, that creating a new world order and a diplomatic new world order in terms of trade and relations. So BRICS itself becomes a very critical role within establishing a new international reality beyond Western lenses. And this is why it's important that South Africa plays a critical role when it's chairing BRICS this year to facilitate those dialogues that will result in the creation of a more just and fair international system beyond Western lens.
Thank you very much, Luazi Somyab, and also Aliyah Vaez. We do appreciate your insights, contribution, and time on the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.